Now, please, a warm round of applause, warm welcome to Jackie and Kimberly.
G'day. Okay, so we're a bit different to a lot of the other speakers because we're university researchers and we're from Canberra. And I've been sitting here being really fascinated all day, so I've got a pretty big bar to hit. And guess what? I also have lots of really boring statistics in our talk. But let's talk about well-being before we start trying to reduce it for you. Okay, so we are wellbeing researchers. That means we are looking at how do we improve the wellbeing of different groups of people. We're part of the team that runs the annual Regional Wellbeing Survey, which aims to shed a bit better light on people's quality of life, health and wellbeing in rural and regional communities. And one of the challenges we often hit is that a lot of people still don't think wellbeing is particularly important. So I usually start my talks talking about why wellbeing actually matters. How many people here think your wellbeing matters? Excellent. Now, if I'm talking to a group of policymakers in Canberra, I get a really different number of hands going up because they say it's all well and good to have fluffy things like wellbeing, but what does it really do for us? So what we know wellbeing does, I don't need to tell all of you, but it's good for me to practice. Wellbeing is about being in a state of mental health where you can realise your potential, you can achieve the things you're meant to be able to achieve in life, you can support others and you can support your community. If you have good wellbeing, you actually tend to make more income, be able to take better care of your family and your friends, be better able to contribute in your community, be able to take better care of your land. So often poor wellbeing and poor health of the land do go hand in hand. So we do need to see ways of improving farmer wellbeing and farming household wellbeing. And in particular, we often hear a lot of concerns about farmer health, but a lot of our responses to farmer health problems are to say, let's treat it once it's gotten bad. And that's often a challenge for a whole range of reasons. So I'll just click a couple of these on. Okay, so when we think about health promotion and health intervention, often the response when we see a lot of problems with farmer health is to get more health services out there. How many of you really enjoy going and accessing your local health services and don't avoid going to see them until the last possible minute? How many of you wait to the last possible minute until you probably need to be in hospital before you go and access a health service? Yeah, a few. Good to see a few honest people out there. So, and it's particularly acute in rural and regional areas where it takes a lot more effort to access services. We need a lot more prevention. So the questions we get asked a lot are, how do we actually put in place preventive health measures? How do we make sure they're working at the times when people's well-being is under the most stress? So for example, when we're deep in drought, when someone's had a market crash that's affecting everything coming off their land, or when they've had 5 different things hit their farm in the last 5 years. So first they had the flood, then they had the fire, then the drought hit so they couldn't actually regrow the pasture. How do we actually try and put systems in place that help people support their well-being through that? And we get asked that question a lot, and one of the answers we often give is, well, a lot of people say regenerative farming is one of the things that can help with that. Nothing is perfect, but it's one of the things that gets brought up. And the first thing we get asked by the health professionals is, well, tell me where in the spectrum of preventive health medicine it sits. And there's nowhere actually for it, because in the health paradigm, we tend to think about prevention sort of down here a bit, and then we've got all these things we can do and spend money on that go into treatment. So one of our jobs is to start by saying to health professions and to policymakers, we need to think differently about health, and we need to think differently about health prevention for farmers. So I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about what we know influences wellbeing, and then we'll talk about some of the work we're doing on regenerative farming. Okay, so if you are anyone, doesn't matter if you live in a city or on a farm, a lot of things affect your wellbeing. One of them is your physical health, but it's actually possible to have good wellbeing while having health problems. That's something we often forget. And a lot of our work is focused on good mental health, so people being able to live good quality lives even if they have some physical health problems. Because when you actually look at the incidence of physical health problems in the population, the large majority of people live with 1 or 2 physical health problems. But you can do that with a quality of life and with managing it well. So we need to have good health. We need to think about how to manage that. We need to have a good quality environment. Financial well-being does matter. We need to have a certain base level of income and be able to cover our costs. You need to feel a sense of belonging to your community, to your family, to your friends. to feel safe where you live. If you live in a place where you don't feel safe, that has very negative impacts on your well-being. To have work that is fulfilling and doesn't stress you out so much it has a negative impact. Good emotional well-being and good social relationships. Not too much to ask. Sounds a bit hard, doesn't it, on a Saturday? But those are the things that if you have that beautiful mix of everything, you tend to have good well-being. For farmers and for people living in rural and remote areas, access to health services is another big stress on health because it is very difficult in a lot of places. The effects of living in isolated and remote places do actually have an impact, and a lot of our work is about how you overcome that. And then for farmers, there's been tons of studies done that show the stress of being on a farm is actually, for a lot of farmers, very occupation specific. So the things of not being able to predict what's coming next season, not being able to predict what's going to happen with the climate, with the market, putting in the $1 million crop and not knowing, is this the one in 3 or 4 years where it's going to actually grow something? And that actually leads to an accumulation of wellbeing stresses for a lot of farmers, not all. What's amazing about farmers is a lot cope incredibly well with that and are incredibly resilient to that. But I think that's something average person in the city just doesn't get, that there's not a paycheck every 2 weeks, that there's not that sort of certainty of life, and that that's a big wellbeing stress in and of itself. Okay, so we've got people worried about farmers, and then we've got this whole group of regenerative farmers who've been coming along for the last decade or two and saying, hang on, when we farm this way, we feel better. And we've been hearing a lot of that and certainly involved a lot in talking to people, but one of the things we kept finding was people saying there's no evidence base. So we heard regenerative farmers saying, I've got improved relationships because it's actually less effort to take care of the farm, so I can actually spend a bit more time with the family. We heard them saying, I've got less stress and worry because I feel more in control of what's happening on the farm. Saying I feel better prepared for drought and better able to cope into drought. That's something that can help well-being. They don't actually say I've got improved self-efficacy, because only a psychologist would say that. But self-efficacy is one of the most important things for your mental health. So that's where you feel not that you'll always be able to achieve everything you want, but that you know how to achieve it if the circumstances are right. So you feel confident that I know what I can do to cope with different situations, even if they're not ideal. That sense of self-efficacy is critical to our mental health and to successful farming. And increased financial security and stability. So we're seeing a lot of people saying things about, do we have better well-being? But we didn't have empirical evidence. So when we went to policymakers, they said, where are your statistics? Where are your graphs? I'm not going to believe necessarily what a couple evangelists of the regenerative farming movement say, to put it bluntly. That's the sort of reaction we get. So we needed to turn what a lot of people in this room know into evidence, and that's what we're working on. And we also get some surprises when we do that sometimes. Some things we think are true don't always necessarily show up in the data, other things do. So we've recently done a few projects, and I've listed a few of them there, and people will be able to access the slides afterwards, so I won't go through them in detail. But we collect data each year trying to measure the extent to which people engage in regenerative farming as part of our regional wellbeing survey, which includes 3,000 to 4,000 farmers every year, regenerative and non-regenerative. Kimberly here, who'll talk in a minute, is doing her PhD looking at regenerative farmers and their well-being and seeing if we can actually see a real evidence base and show that to a level that's provable enough that we can actually say there's a policy agenda here that needs to be talked about. And we've just finished a project where we were one of a team of researchers from different institutions working with the Australian National University, looking at a group of 14 best practice regenerative graziers and comparing them to others and seeing how they were. So we've got a few things going on. We've just done some work on drought resilience as well. So what I'm going to do is, for the rest of the talk, we'll be talking about what we've been finding. And the first thing that's important to talk about is, as good Canberra researchers, we said to all the regenerative farmers we knew, so how would you measure regenerative farming? In a survey, how would you ask questions that measure whether someone's a regenerative farmer? How easy do you think that was? Not really easy. So what we did was we've tried a few ways of actually measuring it, because unfortunately for our job, we need to turn the philosophy of regenerative farming into survey questions. That's not an easy ask. And we also looked at a couple different things, because we had a few people saying to us, people might label themselves this, but having the label doesn't make you a regenerative farmer. It's about whether you're doing it using the right principles and practices. So we actually tested that out. In our big survey, we asked people, do you call yourself a regenerative farmer? Do you call yourself an organic farmer, a biodynamic farmer, a holistic farmer? And they could tick yes or no. Then we separately asked some questions saying, to what extent is it important on your farm to do certain things? And that included, how important is it to you to keep maintaining ground cover, to work on improving soil health, to match production to capacity? We've got to increase diversity of plants and organisms, and that one we've been hearing about all through today, how important is it for you to monitor what's going on and then learn from it and implement and change what you're doing based on that learning? And then we looked at whether we could predict people's well-being using those different definitions. So one we call the labelling approach, where you say, yep, I'm organic. The other we call the philosophy approach, where it's, are you actually using principles of that farming, even if you would not ever want to be labelled a regenerative farmer? And there's a few of them out there. There's about 20% of the people who did all the philosophy of regenerative farming who did not tick that they were regenerative farmers, and a couple who scribbled rude words next to that question saying, no, I'm not one of them. So we've got some interesting things going on. Now, here's the first of a lot of horrenda graphs. Who enjoys graphs? Oh, I've got a couple. Okay, we'll talk you through them. All right, so what this is showing is that people who self-label as not being a regenerative farmer, this is just farmers, they've got about average well-being for farmers, because most farmers are sort of just there. People who call themselves any kind of regenerative farmer, yeah, they're sort of about similar. People who call themselves organic had lower well-being than average. Not all of those had regenerative principles. I remember, who was it earlier who said because you're organic it doesn't mean you're regenerative? Our data very much supports that. We see some organic farmers who are also farming to regenerative principles, but also quite a few who are not. So we need to be careful, because we can't make claims about everyone who does these things with these labels has better well-being or is doing the same thing. Biodynamic farmers, a little bit better than the organic farmers. Where we got the really high well-being that was better than average was the people who adhered to all the regenerative principles of farming, not just one or two, but actually had that systems thinking approach to it. So we are seeing higher well-being. I haven't explained the well-being measures. They're very exciting and technical, and anyone who wants to, I'm around all night and I'd like to talk about it over drinks, exactly the painful details of how we measure that. But I will digress one bit. When you get asked questions on a survey that say, overall on a scale from 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life? How many think that's a bit motherhoody, bit eh? Okay, so they've done around 100 studies matching that to people's life expectancy, their actual health outcomes. If you answer towards the bottom of that scale, consistently for a couple of years, your lifespan's typically 10 to 20 years shorter than people who answer up the top. So it's all right if you're down the bottom for a little bit, just to not panic people in the room. But so there is actually a lot of evidence that these things tell you meaningful things. So when we ask, so next time you get the Regional Wellbeing Survey, and I'm sure few of you have probably done it and sworn a lot, those fluffy questions are there for a reason. They actually do tell us things. So we're seeing that philosophy of regenerative farming is what matters, making sure people are thinking about their farm that way, using that systems thinking. And the rest of the talk, Kimberly will be talking a bit about what we're seeing in terms of wellbeing, because we don't want to just know wellbeing's better, we want to know why. So I'll hand over to her.
Well, we're going to come back to Jackie as well, so you'll get her in the third part of this talk. So what I'll be going through in these slides is just looking at some of the findings from the research projects that we've been working on. So this research here that I've got on the slide, I hope everyone can read it okay. So I might go through them, so people who can't see. But the first finding here, this is from some work that I did with Jackie and my other supervisor, Penny Upton, looking at the associations between regenerative farming and wellbeing. And what we found here was that regenerative farming is more important to different types of wellbeing. So the first group here, with each bar, so the blue bar there represents those farmers who farm with very low numbers of regenerative farming characteristics. And then it goes up to the yellow bar, and they're our farmers who have lots of regenerative farming characteristics. So we can see that generally the yellow bar is higher than all the other bars. The first group there is our life satisfaction measure. So that's our general measure of happiness, and the yellow bar is higher. The measure in the middle is our personal wellbeing index, which takes into account different domains of people's lives as well. And the third one, where we see a big difference between the wellbeing of regenerative farmers compared to others, is our measure of worthwhileness, which is our feelings that we have. We've got lots of meaning and purpose into our life. So that's kind of where we're thinking that regenerative farming might have more of an impact. Oh, there you go. And this relationship holds. We we tested if the relationship held depending on farm type, looking at age and gender as well. So it did too, because older people tend to be happier, and there's also some differences between wellbeing around the different genders. This was one of the first, I guess, surprises that we found in our data, and it appears that regenerative farming might also have some positive implications on not just our mental health and well-being, but perhaps also our physical health. So here we surveyed our group of, it's a small sample of 14 of the best practice regenerative farmers, and they had reported much higher levels of general health compared to our best comparison sample of non-regenerative farmers. So you never get 63% of males aged 40 to 60 years old reporting that they have very good or excellent health. So we do think there's something going on in this group that needs to be explored. Here, one way we can measure well-being is looking at our well-being across different aspects of our life. So we asked people in this slide their well-being with their standard of living, their relationships, general health, 7 different measures. And here we found that there were some differences in regenerative farmers. They had better satisfaction with their health, better relationships, and also reported higher satisfaction in future security as well, which is reflected in some of the conversations we've had with regenerative farmers too. So why do regenerative farmers have higher well-being than non-regenerative farmers? And these were questions that we wanted to look at answering as well. And we had some ideas. Jackie spoke about some of the determinants of well-being. We know what those are, and she spoke about the term self-efficacy, and that's our feelings around that we can actually do what we want to do. So we thought we might start there and explore how what the relationship between regenerative agriculture and self-efficacy was. So here we found regenerative farmers had a lot higher self-efficacy compared to non-regenerative farmers. So I'll read these questions out. The first bar there is, I'm confident I can achieve the things I want on my farm. I'm confident I can meet my farm business objectives, confidence in making right decisions about farm management, and confidence in handling changes in market conditions. So our regenerative farmers here, again, it's a small sample, but they reported a much higher a belief in self that they could do those things. And again, looking at farming self-efficacy, these last 3 here, a lot higher too. The first one there is, I'm confident I can cope well with difficult conditions on my farm. Confidence in improving and maintaining the health of their vegetation, land and water. And the last one, which has the biggest difference, is I feel optimistic about my farming future, which we found interesting as well. Another really important wellbeing determinant, and one of the biggest ones, is our financial factors, and that does play a big role in our wellbeing. so we wanted to have a little look at this, and what we found was that our best practice regenerative farmers reported better satisfaction with their financial performance. So when we asked them about their profitability over the last, this is self-reported as well, so we didn't ask them actually their numbers or anything. This is just self-reported, their average farm business performance over the last 3 years, and our best practice regenerative farmers were, majority of them reported that they were making a moderate to large profit. Now again, this is subjective, but we you can see similar patterns in the other objective data forms, such as in the ABARES, which shows a similar difference, and that our regenerative farmers report more of that stability of financial performance. And again, we see a similar result here when we ask farmers to report their average cash flow as well. So our regenerative farmers were more likely to report good or very good farm cash flow. I'll hand back over to Jackie now. She can talk about chickens and eggs.
All right. Yep, no worries. Okay, so we're almost done. So what we're trying to do in our research is say not just is there better wellbeing, but why is there better wellbeing, and is it stemming from the sorts of things that are being done on regenerative farms? We're seeing with the farming self-efficacy, regenerative farmers are feeling more confident to achieve their objectives. They're feeling more in control on their farms, and that fits with what regenerative farmers tell us, that it's giving them a way of understanding their farming systems and planning ahead. And they also often say to us that they feel they're more resilient to drought. And that's obviously been a slightly big topic recently. So we've had a lot of people saying, can you use your data sets and tell us, do we see any evidence that we're actually seeing better drought resilience? And that was a complicated analysis, because to look at whether farmers are more resilient in drought and to prove there's high resilience, we have to be able to compare farmers who are in drought and out of drought and see if their performance changes through time. So I'm going to not explain exactly every statistical method we used, because I've only got 5 minutes. But what we did, we were asked by NRM regions, could we do an analysis looking at 16 different natural resource management practices, several of them which are common to regenerative farming, in 23 different situations, sometimes with graziers, sometimes with cropping. And can we see if each of them is associated with a farmer doing better during drought? So can we look at it and say, does the farmer do better in drought? And we did that by looking both at the farmer's well-being and at their farm performance. So I'm going to give you a very quick and very painful idea of what we go through when we do this. I won't do this for all of the 16 examples in the 23 situations. I'm going to take one. What we did was we'd take something like this, where we asked people to what extent they agreed that ensuring I keep good ground cover is a priority in my land management. And what we've got here is people who prioritise ground management and say they do and don't do this. So let me just remember which colours are what. In the light green and the light brown, you've got the farmers who don't prioritise ground cover. And this is just looking at graziers on the left and mixed crop grazing on the right. In the dark green and the dark brown, you've got the ones who do prioritise managing ground cover. And what the measure is here is a wellbeing measure. Higher bars mean better wellbeing. What we can see there is that when we're not in drought, the light green to the dark green, there's a small difference in wellbeing. And the people who prioritise ground cover, they've got better wellbeing. When it comes to being in drought, that gap widens. That's what we're actually looking at in this project. Do we see a bigger gap? So are people experiencing less of a decline in wellbeing during drought if they're doing this practice? And what we're seeing here is a pretty resounding yes. So just to be clear, most farmers in drought experience loss of wellbeing, whether they're regenerative or not. The regenerative farmers are experiencing less loss of wellbeing. We care about that because we know that this is one of the big triggers that can lead people into some very bad outcomes on the farm in terms of mental health. So for us, this is a really big ticket result, because we're actually being able to show that this is conferring resilience to drought. And this is isolating one regenerative practice. Our next step is to match a lot of practices together and to look at the more holistic picture of the multiple practices people are doing on their land, not just one of them. So we also did really exciting regressions. Who would like me to explain this in painful detail? All right then, we're moving along. And I've already explained this one, so I won't go through it. So here's a Horrenda table, just to break up the Horrenda graphs. And green is good. This is sort of when we went through and did the same process with all the practices, some of the things we found, prioritising maintaining ground cover was actually one of our strongest drought resilience practices in terms of both maintaining wellbeing and improving farm financial performance through drought, for graziers particularly. So not nearly as strong a relationship for people doing pure cropping. So we need to better differentiate what croppers mean when they say, I prioritise maintaining ground cover. We think we need better measures there. We saw increasing feed reserves is positive for drought resilience, farm drought planning to an extent, but actually farmers who plan for all the types of risks they plan on their farm do better in drought, not just the ones who just plan for drought. So if you just plan for drought and not everything else that's going to be happening at the same time, you don't do as well as if you plan for all the possible risks and have a plan in place for how am I going to manage those, especially if they all happen at the same time. And monitoring whether you're achieving your environmental objectives, good for your well-being. Not so many results for farm finances. And down the bottom there, and this links into the previous talk, people who managed to successfully manage grazing pressure during drought did a lot better. So we saw a really positive outcome for that with drought resilience. Now I'm going to wrap up. Yep. So I'm going to skip this bit, but broadly speaking, what our work is doing is translating the things a lot of people know into really boring statistics, which then hopefully can convince policymakers. We're excited to do this because we enjoy the statistics, sadly. But look, I think we are seeing some really important things, and one of them is we need to really define what we mean by regenerative farming, because your well-being isn't better if you give yourself a label as a farmer, it's better if you change your farming systems and your thinking. So we are seeing that coming through very strongly. We have a long way to go with this work, so we're aiming to continue doing this research for years to come, and we want to talk more to everyone here about what are the ways you think well-being might be improved, what things could we look at, because then we hope we can get that evidence base to say it's worth investing in helping people transition to these systems. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you're staying for questions. We've got about 90 seconds before the scones come out. Look, the main sort of question seems to be there around the causative element. So which comes first? Is it that you feel better and then you're open to regenerative ag, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, really good question.
Oh, sorry.
Turn that off.
Yeah, just push that again.
Am I back on?
No, to hold it a bit longer. Oh, come on.
We'll get there eventually. This is why I don't like answering causation questions. How many of you can hear me when I talk like this? Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. All right, I'll just yell a bit. Okay,
yeah,
so
batteries.
the chicken and egg one is a really, really important question.
Batteries, mate.
We are seeing, so in the drought resilience work, we were able to apply what's called the Bradford Hill causal criteria. They're what are used by health epidemiologists when you don't have perfect experimental data, because sadly, our ethics committee tells us we can't experiment on farmers, so we're not allowed to actually say, you go and regeneratively farm like this, you don't do it, we're just going to do terrible things to you. But what we are doing is in the regional wellbeing survey and through some other surveys, we are tracking people over time, and we're aiming to get people who transition from non-regenerative to regenerative farming so that we can track as their wellbeing go up. And we believe it will, because on all the other causal criteria, we are seeing positive outcomes, and when we subject it to a lot of tests. So
Thanks, mate.
whoever asks that question, come find me and I'll talk to you about temporality, plausibility, coherence, and all the other causal criteria we've been using to try and lock this down a bit.
It just swapped around. Did you account for the idea that being slightly discontent is a great life motivator?
Yeah, people who are slightly discontent often have high well-being. So actually the two are not incompatible. In fact, it's often the people who are the more critical thinkers are actually quite happy and have high well-being, or not happy. So you can measure happiness. We measure life satisfaction and feeling your life is worthwhile, because they're more meaningful indicators than asking if someone is happy. So you may not be happy, but you might be quite satisfied and feel your life is quite worthwhile. So yeah, absolutely, being slight malcontent, fantastic for your well-being sometimes.
Great. Oh, look, we might have to leave it there. I'm sure we could keep talking like any of our speakers for a whole hour, but another warm round of applause for these fabulous girls from UC, please.